Welcome to Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Your Daily, President Trump has made a few comments about U.S. cattle producers. Bryan Whaley with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association joins us to find out more about the workers ranchers are doing headed into winter and what conversations are going on nationally. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Your Daily. And joining me on Farm Your Daily, we're going to take a look at the state of cattle in Iowa. And to do so, we have with us Bryan Whaley, the CEO of the Iowa Cattlemen's Association. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us on Farm Here Daily. Hope all is well. And let's just start off with just the situation we're in at the moment. Iowa has seen a pretty steady herd for the most part. Where are we at now that we're heading into winter? What's our herd looking like? And what are some of the questions or concerns you're feeling from producers?
Yeah, David, thanks for having me on today to talk a little bit about the cattle industry and specifically here in Iowa. Obviously, there's no shortage of news with what's happening in the cattle world. Everything from markets to, as you mentioned, herd supply. And, it's been talked about that we are at our lowest herd numbers for many years, it's basically right now we're in a supply demand issue with where we're at. But here in Iowa, we're fortunate that we have the feedstuffs here to feed cattle. We do a great job of feeding cattle. We have a variety of different options presented by our producers, whether it's in a building or in an open feedlot, and we have the feedstuffs here to do it. And so we do see an opportunity for cattle to be brought into the state and to be fed, and then obviously processed. Either we do have a few plants here, but also mostly in Nebraska and then Illinois as well. But we're in a really good spot right now on the fed cattle side. Obviously the shortage, going back to that comment I made earlier, we do have a shortage of cows, and it's across the country right now. And it's something that it's just going to take time. I think when you think about how long it takes to get a cow into production, it's a significant amount of time, a lot different than it is with swine or poultry or other species. So, we're looking at a time period here where it is going to take a little bit to rebuild. But I think our cow-calf producers are doing well. We've had early on this last year, we had good grass. So I think our hay supplies are adequate and maybe a little bit above going into the winter. And so we'll just see. We got our first taste of snow and cold this last weekend. So I think everybody's now going to be ready for it, whether we like it or not.
As you said, it does take a long time to get a cow all the way to where they're heading off to the slaughterhouse. And that process is time intensive and expensive. And we've seen with the shrink of the herd, of one of the smallest herds we've had in decades, that cattle prices have naturally gone up. That's kind of the rules of supply and demand there working. But we also have an issue that goes on where if prices get too high, people are going to start targeting that and maybe artificially influencing, whether it's through imports or other means. Now, if you're a producer 2 years ago that saw, hey, cattle's getting pretty expensive, I want to invest. And if you're a producer a year ago, I want to invest. Well, you still got a year left. Maybe you're starting to get some cows into production, but you have that higher cost of investing into the situation. And now we might face a situation where there's a rise in imports or there's rise in pressure to lower prices, where producers are going to see a decline in some of the cost of what their inputs were, or a decline in the prices they get. But they had those high input prices at the beginning, the investment. What are producers thinking here in Iowa when they have invested over those 2 years and are starting to get this pressure now that prices for beef are too high?
Well, right now the one thing I will talk about, David, is, the cattle market and the industry is very complex. And you think about the length of time it does take, as you referenced, There is a lot of risk in this market right now. That's the number one concern that our producers, over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, that they've really expressed to us is, how can some of the words or some of the comments that are made influence this market so much and impact it to the point where they don't know whether they can either get in right now with the high cost of feeder cattle or where they can market their cattle later on down the road. And then sometimes, we don't have a lot of risk protection, outside of just normal marketing strategies that they have besides LRP. And even in some cases now, is LRP even a worthwhile product, depending upon where you're at in the market and where you're buying and where you're selling and all those. There's a lot of other factors that go into that. I think that product has helped us to a point, but I think there's still some things that can make an impact on the risk there. And so, as our producers are looking at this, and it's not just looking at the feeder and the fed cattle market, but it's looking this fall. I mean, I'm watching the bred heifer market. I'm watching the as we get into fall calving, if there are some, if there's some pairs that are being sold, or what's happening on are we selling any bred cows, and who's retaining some of the ones that they have. So I think there's a lot of risk right now in this market. You talk about the beef prices. For many years, our producers, whether it's cow, calf, fed cattle, I mean, they've taken taken it in the red column a little bit at times and continue to fight through it and find ways to keep going. And now we're at a spot where we're making a little bit of money. And now all of a sudden we're trying to have that market influenced in some ways against us. And I think that's what's really caused some frustration in the producers across not only Iowa, but I think across the country, and why you've seen some of the comments. This market is volatile. I mean, it is just one way you're limit down, the next day you're limit up, or
It's
anywhere in
crazy.
between
I've
there.
never seen any markets like this in my time,
and
watching
and
it.
to and to track it and just watching it from the outside, imagine what you're having to do if your livelihood depends on making a dollar out of feeding cattle or raising cattle or selling feeder cattle, on the cow calf side. There is a lot of that goes into this market, and these producers are really stressed right now about what do we do, and what are the decisions that we need to make sure that we stay profitable and then viable. Because ultimately, David, and I think if you go look at the economics of this, specifically in Iowa, there are perfect examples of where our livestock industry is strong. Those rural communities are very strong. And these producers are putting their money back into the community a lot of the times, whether it's by buying equipment, paying down debt, a variety of things that they do, or investing in their operation. Um, you talked about input costs. We're faced with the same thing some of our row crop guys are. Increase interest rates. We've got increase in diesel fuel costs. The list could go on and on those things. Feed is up if you're having to purchase any feed. So there are some things that are out there that our producers are really faced with. And I think for the most part, they're doing a really good job of managing it. We're fortunate we have some companies here in Iowa that can really help them make some good decisions in doing that, and hopefully minimize the risk that's involved right now.
I've kind of set up these questions because I wanted to talk about the big news items that we've had over the last few weeks when it comes to some of the influencers that are dealing with this issue. And I think, there's a couple ones that come top to mind. There's recent calls to increase Argentinian imports. There's potential calls to bring in more Brazilian beef imports. There are calls to investigate slaughterhouses, and there's also the border closure between the U.S. and Mexico. Out of all of those recent news items, for Iowa in particular, what strikes you as the most meaningful when you heard about them and as you've learned about them?
Wow, that could be a really loaded question. They're all impacting different aspects going forward. If you look at we all know that we have to import beef, and the type of beef that we're importing is pretty lean, and it's probably going to be put into a ground product, right? And so it's not, and the amount that we from Argentina was not going to really influence that supply at a big amount. I think it was more the messaging around how that's done. Now, if you look at opening up and importing some more, we reduce tariffs on Brazil, then they import some more, then that changes the subject a little bit. And I think from a producer standpoint is, man, let's let that market work. Let's let it be a free market. Let's let things happen. Let's not influence things one way or another. We understand that beef prices are what's in the news and what we hear, and obviously we understand from a consumer perspective that beef prices for them we're hearing are awful high. And I'm not going to deny that they aren't at an increased level right now, but what isn't? I mean, we've seen inflation in a lot of different things when you go through the grocery store. And so I think you've got to look at it in comparison, but the one thing that I guess the message that I would like to share is don't necessarily blame the cattle producers. And I've used this example when our producers load up a truck and it's taken to a processing plant, they typically know what they're going to get for those cattle when they're unloaded. And at that point, that's what they get. They do not, from that point forward, influence anything in the market and in terms of a consumer in the rest of the supply chain and what those costs are in the grocery store. And so I think that sometimes our producers get the messaging doesn't get relayed correctly in terms of where the impact that our producers have. I mean, they raise it and they sell it. And after that, from there on, everything else in the supply chain continues to move forward, and they may need to make some money as well. That's how our economy works. And so I think we've got to look at that whole supply chain as we go forward. And I guess I would say that's probably been the biggest thing. The impact of the comment last Friday on, the meat processing plants, what typically people in our world refer to them as the big four meat packers, right? Again, going back to, we want a fair market, right? A competitive marketplace that doesn't have that participation by all packers and processors and everybody else, that we can ensure that the price changes reflect what's happening in the market and what those signals are, rather than some type of a market power or movement in another way that shouldn't be influencing that market. And that's been a strong stance of the Iowa Cattlemen's Association for many years. And we have very strong policy on that right now.
I think it's fair to say that farming, especially recently, has become more of a game of margins. And when you have such a reduction in the size of the herd, every dollar matters that much more because you can't spread it around as much as you may have before. So, do you feel now farmers or ranchers in particular, are getting the percentage of the food dollar that they need to continue to be competitive, to continue to actually make a living?
So I think you've got to look at that. I mean, everybody's profit margins are going to be a little bit different depending upon their operation. If you're producing your own feedstuffs, you're going to have a little bit different than if you're having to bring it into your facility, right? So I think it's a matter of looking at where can we continue to move forward, and where can we manage our input costs to make sure that we are being profitable. I think our producers, as I mentioned before, they do a great job of putting out a great product. And I, not to use an example, we all want the best iPhone or the best phone. We all want the best car, right? We all want the best piece of equipment that's going to last a while. Well, we also want the best piece of beef, and I think that's out there, and I think demand has shown that. And if you look at the research out there, still for many years, the number one thing that influences consumers purchasing beef is taste. And our producers have done a great job of doing that. And so we're at a time, going back to the supply and the demand issue now, that those prices have elevated and they're able to make a little bit of money. And so where they're at now, I think, is in good shape. and we all know that that money's going to come full circle. They're going to be able to grow their operation. If they have a little bit, then they may lean towards expanding, which then we can grow that cow herd. And so there's some things that I think are going to happen here. Over the next few years, I think that will be very impactful within our industry.
I recall, I think 2 or 3 years ago, when the concerns of the smaller cattle herd were being really spread, they were starting to spread a bit. That at that point, that they estimated, oh, it'd take about 2, maybe 3 years to return it to a better size or a more normal, typical size. But we're now 2 to 3 years later, and it still feels like that cattle herd's small. What is influencing that? And is this just a aspect of the market that you've seen through your career? And sometimes it just takes a little bit longer to build that herd.
Well, it does. Number one, we've talked about that already once, but I think there's some other factors. I think in Iowa this spring, we were fortunate for the majority of the state. We got out of our drought situation for the most part, or at least according to the drought monitor, right? But the other rest of the country didn't. And I think we're still seeing areas of drought across our country. It's gotten better. But that has if you go out west and some of those other Southwest states, drought has been a big influence in why people have sold cows. They just don't have the grass for those cows to graze. And so that has been a big impact in weather. So number one, weather is a challenge, right? Number two, I think, we talk about this, and it's just in agriculture in general right now. We have an aging producer within our agricultural industry, and it doesn't matter at what part of our industry you're looking at, a row crop, or you're looking at a cattle rancher, or somebody who's just feeding cattle. And I think we're starting to see some change and some decrease. I mean, it's been noted that we have the number of producers that are out there, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's significant over the last 10 years in a decrease. And so that you don't have as many people raising those cattle, and that makes a big impact as well. I think, you mentioned right now, you mentioned earlier in a question, and I didn't really address it, the New World screwworm. Usually we're running about 1.2 million head of feeder cattle come across that border, the southern border of Mexico, and are fed out in some of our southern states. The last I heard, or the numbers I saw, which when we closed, what was it, in May or June at that time, we had only brought in about 200,000. So think about that number that we haven't brought in, which would have been fed here, which would have been put into our food chain, right? And so I think there's another factor. Are we going to open the border? I don't know. And there's give or take on either side of that. We eradicated the screwworm in the 1960s, and to hear how they did it, and to listen to some of the media talk about that, and then to see it now in real life potentially being another factor. I think we've still got some people that are really concerned about that. And I think so. What we do with that southern border is going to be another influence into it as well. Those are just a few of the things right now that I think are big within our cattle market or industry that are influencing the markets.
So let's go over some of the actions that the Iowa Cattlemen's Association have done. You've released some press releases in response to some of the recent news items, including Argentina, the southern border closure, as well as some Packer investigation concerns. What are you guys looking at? What are you guys working on for the producers in the state?
Great question, and thanks for giving me an opportunity, because sometimes people don't always see what the association is doing behind the scenes, right? What's that value proposition, and what's the value they get out of being a member of our association? And I will tell you, it has been all hands on deck here in the association from that first Friday afternoon comment the last 3 weeks. I've got a great team here. Kelly Klink, our government relations and policy director, she has done a tremendous job of being in communication with all of our congressional offices on numerous times. She's had conversations with the ag committees, both the House and the Senate. both Republican and Democratic. And so we've done all those things. We've worked with Secretary Nag here in Iowa, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, had conversations with him. Obviously surveying our producers to see what we can do to help them. I mean, specifically with the shutdown and how we can influence and make sure that they're getting the help that they need in those regards. But around specific topics, number one, when they released the USDA plan, which I think we need a plan, right, to move forward. And I commend Secretary Rollins and her team for putting forward a plan that's very robust, has a lot of different topics. And there's a lot of good things in there. You talk about maybe some more regional processing facilities. We've talked about that for years, beginning farmer things. But there was one thing, and we had been working on this and still are working on this and having conversations around, is CRP as a grazing opportunity. How can we utilize a working land CRP type program for us here in Iowa specifically, and also some of the other Midwest states and out east that have that opportunity to help grow the cow herd? Sometimes I think we get forgotten about here in the Midwest that, we can graze cattle here. We've got some good grasslands. And then what happens in the fall? We've got some in the cornfields. We're grazing them on stocks, right? And so we've got opportunities here in Iowa. And I think we kind of, that was the one area that we have continually pushed forward up the chain, whether it's work we've done with NCBA, or whether it's work we've done with Secretary Nag and his connections, or us moving things forward, is trying to continue to have the conversation around CRP as an opportunity for grazing. Obviously, we've been involved in the trade conversations as well, and what that's going to do within the market. We continue to monitor a lot of different things that are happening with this recent announcement, right? What's that look like? We know there's been past investigations that have occurred. I think Senator Grassley initiated one during COVID during that time. So what were the results of that? What has changed over time? And then what can we get that information? And then what's going to happen going forward? There's been some settlements there in that conversation over time. And you look at a settlement, no admission of guilt, right? But they're paying out the money, and everybody looks at that differently.
Right.
So we've got to look at all of those things right now. And we've been involved and engaged in having those conversations at all different levels, and sharing that with our members. We're putting out news releases or policy briefs to our members on a regular basis, keeping them informed. And I just want them to know that, yes, we are working on their behalf on a daily basis. We have numerous conversations. I've been on the phone a lot with other states, whether it's Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, South Dakota. I know Kelly's talked with South Dakota and Minnesota. And so we are trying to work together and see what we can do to continue to move this industry forward, to make sure that we continue to make sure our producers are profitable and viable long-term as you look at succession planning.
Absolutely. Bryan Whaley is the CEO of the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, joining me on Farm Your Daily. Bryan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.